Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. Thank you for joining us as we count down to our milestone 200th episode. I'm Mary, and today's guest is Vera Cherepanova. Hi, Vera. It's lovely to have you here. Please tell us about yourself.
Hi, Mary. Let me start from saying thank you for inviting me to your podcast. I feel privileged to be with you today and to be able to talk about the things that matter to ethics and compliance professionals.
Thank you.
And obviously, congratulations on the 200 episodes milestone. I think this is very, very impressive.
Thank you.
So now about myself. I'm the founding partner of Milan-based boutique ethics and compliance consultancy, which is called Studio Etica. And I know that to my Anglo-Saxon friends, this name sounds a bit funny. I hope it sounds a little bit less funny in Italian. So we advise clients around the world with a particular focus on Europe. We work with market-leading corporations in industries such as FMCG, construction, building materials, telecoms, as well as international not-for-profits like OECD, for example, and the educational sector. Prior to founding Studio Etica, I was a regional compliance officer. I worked in-house actually for 11 years on various positions, starting from internal auditing and then moving to anti-corruption field and then to the original compliance role. At Studio Etica, what we do and what makes us different, as we like to think about it, is our focus on the ethical side, on the ethics side of ethics and compliance. We help organizations achieve ethics-driven cultural transformations that drive not only legal compliance, but rather lead to enhanced integrity and positive behavioral change. More on that in a minute. So that's us.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Great experience and good to have the European focus. There are so many service and solution providers in the United States that it's lovely to come across one of the vendors that is specialized in European area and covering so many more clients. So a couple of the areas that you focus on are behavioral risk and behavioral change. What does each one mean, and what's an actionable idea to, first off, help practitioners think in a more dedicated way about behavioral risk in their compliance programs? And then what about how you best effect positive behavioral change in organizations?
A great question. Indeed, a behavioral lens to ethics and compliance is a topic of my big personal and professional interest. Why people follow the rules, why people at times break the rules. When our values are in conflict, how do we make a decision which course of action to pursue? All of these interesting, difficult, complex, intriguing, whatever questions led me to behavioral science some 5 years ago. And as you rightly framed it in your question, Mary, behavioral risk management has two parts: behavioral risk assessment and behavioral change that obviously builds on assessments. In broad terms, behavioral risk is the risk of unwanted behavior, including various types of misconduct, leading to poor decisions or outcomes for the organization or its stakeholders. Looking through a behavioral risk lens means looking at the organizational culture and how the culture steers employee behavior towards what's expected and what's the accepted standard of behavior. As we have seen in many recent corporate scandals, and we continue to see it in today's scandals like SVB, for example, and today we had health outcome, owners convicted of fraud, etc. So we continue to see the same trend. Unethical culture can compromise the effectiveness of ethics and compliance program in many ways, but most importantly, by sending the wrong signal of what's the accepted behavior, standard of behavior in this organization. In the workplace, people learn what's the right thing to do by observation. They observe their peers and their managers, what those people are doing, and they copy. Behaviors that they see repeatedly are called cultural norms. This is the standard norm of behavior, right? And when asked about the drivers of such behaviors, people would normally say, oh, that's how the things are done here. That's how we do things here. And it's also a very popular street language style definition of organizational culture. So you see that the culture and the behaviors are very much connected. So on the behavioral risk assessment, this is essentially a horizon scanning and zooming in on potential risk hotspots. So what you do, you look at your organization, you go one by one on your locations in subsidiaries, departments, teams, whatever you prefer, entities inside of your organization. You make a kind of an intelligent guess where the problems around behavioral risk can be. By intelligent guess, of course, it's not like a guess. You have many sources of data that can be available, source of information here, and that could guide you where you should be looking and making a deep dive. Internal audit reports, whistleblowing reports, what management is asking you to look at, what kind of concerns they have, the board, the audit committee, etc., etc. All of those, any kind of HR satisfaction engagement surveys that your company has run in the past. Scan all that, and that would guide you where you should be zooming in. By zooming in, I mean a very particular thing, because I find that this thing is quite different to what most organizations right now do in terms of their culture assessments. The standard practice is to run that company-wide survey. But we believe that surveys are not necessarily true, because problems rarely lie in the average. Problems are usually in the granular. And when you make a company-wide survey, what you do is you're like averaging out your problems. What we do instead, we do subculture audits. We look at subcultures one by one. For example, we have found with our horizon scanning that this team here potentially poses some behavioral risk in terms of excessive risk taking or whatever. And we go there, we send there a squad, and what they do, they essentially just sit and observe, right? One of the most important things that they do, they sit and a fly on the wall. What are the local heroes? How the meetings go? Who speaks first? Who speaks last? Why? What people think about risk? What people think about misconduct? What's accepted? What's not accepted? What people think about ethics? What is ethical to them and what is unethical to them? So we have all of those questions on the background and we observe. And when we feel it's necessary, we would talk to them, for example, make some kind of an interview or a focus group or whatever. And that would help us to understand if there is an elevated element of behavioral risk over there. So behavioral risk is very context specific. And that's why this focus and zooming in on subcultures makes a lot of sense.
Like a proactive mentorship, it sounds like. So you're basically embedding yourself somewhat in the business to truly understand more than what maybe a typical external party that provides risk assessment services. You're really, when you mention the fly on the wall and attending day-to-day meetings, you're really having a much closer look than some of the traditional, say, risk assessment type activities, and getting involved almost as if you were a team member. So viewing things from the inside out rather than perhaps the outside in, as vendors often do.
Bottom up, exactly. You're right on the point. The bottom up flow, which in my experience quite oftentimes is missing, because what comes top down and what the leaders think that people are doing, it can be very different to the operational reality. And one of the key objectives here is to ensure the flow of the correct and realistic information of what's going on the working floor to the leadership team. Now, on behavioral change, on the second part of the question, on behavioral change is the next phase, and it builds on the risk assessment. If we know our hotspots, we can then intervene to mitigate the behavioral risk we've identified and to change the problematic and unwanted behaviors. Again, it's very important to be super specific about what exactly we would like to see happen, which behavior we want to change, and how it needs to change. And then based on this targeted approach and knowing this target behavior and the context, you're in a better position to select the type of intervention, because there are lots of them. There is a group of interventions that looks at the individual, the I-frame interventions. There is another big group that looks at the systems level, the S-frame interventions. And the first step implementing an intervention is getting together with the whole team and having an open discussion led by the manager, not by the compliance officer, not by anybody external, but by the team leader, the manager, because that's important that they take the full ownership of this behavioral risk and problematic behavior. And so the manager walks them and talks them through why this is problematic. What's the sense of urgency? Why do we need this change? Why we see this behavior as problematic and unwanted? What is the new expected standard of behavior? And what is required of the employees to achieve it? Many companies, I think, make a mistake here, having unrealistic expectations of the length of the behavioral intervention projects. For example, the de-biasing training programs has recently gained a lot of traction, specifically in the framework of DEI initiative. And what companies do, they run a 1-hour training session, and they think that it's enough for a de-biasing. I think it's a bit naive, to say the least, because if you've been biased the whole of your life, because of the country, general context, and whatever, right? It's very naive to think that after an hour of an awareness training, you're going to be a whole different person. Of course not. But that's a nice starting point. It's important to keep in mind that for the actual change to happen and for the new behaviors to stick, it's key to have a series of reinforcing experiences, nudges, communications over weeks or better months after the implementation of the intervention.
Wow, really interesting stuff here. So I'm guessing you do quite a lot in terms of change management as well.
I think that's very much connected.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, a lot of myths here, how easy it is for the new behavior to stick, etc. So we talk a lot with potential clients, for example. First of all, there are lots of myths about the effectiveness because behavioral approach is very experimental. And the first thing that I do, I say upfront, we will try to make the best guess and select the right type of intervention based on our analysis, background, etc., background research, etc. But that might be that the intervention is not going to change the behavior at all, or it's going to change the behavior in a very different way, not as we intended. Because if you think about the drivers of the behavior, there are lots of them. There are psychological drivers, there are sociological drivers, there are drivers coming from the broader environment around the person, etc., etc. And if you think about the organization, it's a super complex system with many drivers and many people and behaviors, etc., all in a very crazy mix. And when you start trying to ticket here, ticket there, and find some entry points to make certain changes, it can potentially be that it's not going to work up front, right? So the important thing here is to be very experimental and also to take into account that it's going to take effort, consistency, and time.
Great points. Thank you. I know that you're also interested in speak-up cultures. What's something that you feel a lot of companies do not do that they should that would improve their speak-up culture?
Oh, I think that's a great point. I think we are all interested in speak-up culture today, especially here in Europe, because we have this whistleblowing directive, which officially came into effect some time ago. Right now, we're in a transposition process, and European countries inside of the European Union are on various stages. There are countries that have already done everything, and they have transposed the directive and they have new laws, etc. There are also outsiders who have even started that process. So it's not very balanced at this point. Anyway, we're moving to one umbrella standard for the whole union, which is a good thing, of course. Answering your question, I think that psychological safety is one of the elements or dimensions of organizational culture, ethical or otherwise. And how you treat whistleblowers says a lot about how you walk your compliance talk. And I have 3 points here regarding what companies do, what they should be doing, and what they shouldn't be doing. Point number 1, many, if not most, companies still believe that zero reports is a good thing. I find this absolutely astonishing.
It's typically people who don't seem to have compliance backgrounds and experience that are the first that are going to state no compliance reports, therefore we're super ethical.
Yeah. I don't have any words because I do hear these things very regularly. Still in 2023. I can't believe this. Point number 2, many, if not most, companies routinely disregard and don't react to reports that actually come on the hotline with many different motivations. Oh, this is not the kind of reports that we wanted to have, right? We want to have serious reports on corruption or bribery or fraud or whatever. And we only get HR reports that some manager is yelling at the team members. Or we got a report that it's 40 degrees Celsius outside, it's summer, it's hot, and our air conditioning is not working. We're not going to respond to that because it has nothing to do with our job responsibility. And educating compliance officers to look differently at this and making the most of any kind of interaction with a whistleblower, because you never know. Maybe this person is just trying you out. Maybe this person has something serious to say, but she just wants to try. How you would react? Would you listen? Would you care? Point number 3, many, if not most, companies still retaliate. It's not necessarily about firing those who report. Instead of a promotion, you're relocated to not very popular location, or they promise you to, a stellar project and you're not getting it anymore, things like that. Together with all that, all of the companies continue to write declarative statements on the importance of speaking up in their code of conduct, in the policy, on the website, in their sustainability reports, etc., etc. And all of that means only one thing to the employees: double standards.
I agree.
Don't trust them. It's a trap. Don't trust them. It's a trap. At the very least, nothing is going to get done. So it's futile. Or worse, you will get yourself in trouble. So don't report anything. Don't say anything.
Yeah, this sounds like absolute back to basics stuff for many of us, but there's no getting away from the data that shows that of late retaliation instances, both complaints and substantiated cases, are up across all of the organizations I've seen that track this data. So we're in a culture of integrity crisis right now, and you might be feeling, oh, this is ridiculous. I worked so hard on non-retaliation. But realistically, and we spoke a little bit offline about this, Vera, are you yourself making a declarative statement in non-retaliation policies and thinking, okay, that should suffice? But what about, are you going to your people and saying, what could we do that would make you fear retaliation less? And this idea comes from Adam Balfour of Bridgestone, who did do that. And the response from his colleagues was, we want to hear stories about people who did speak up. And when you hear that versus what we intuitively or instinctively try to do as compliance officers, which is simply reiterate the non-retaliation policy and that it's safe to speak up, that's two different solutions. So maybe that's part of why we're not adequately managing to address this. And of course, for those of you who missed Jane Norberg's session formerly from the Office of the Whistleblower at the Securities and Exchange Commission, I would strongly encourage you to listen to that episode to hear about some of the common pitfalls that companies make when their colleagues are speaking up first internally and what can drive them to go externally. So Vera, really appreciate that insight there, that you're seeing the same types of things in the European space. I think this is representative of the global trends that we're seeing here. Any other tips that you want to share about speaking up before we move on?
Regarding the speaking up, we were at a conference with Mary quite recently, and there was a lovely session on whistleblowing delivered by a compliance officer and a whistleblowing lawyer. And the final closing remark from them was, unfortunately, at this point of time, we still would say to a potential whistleblower this: if you want to go ahead with it and blowing the whistle and raising your voice, first get a lawyer. And my only wish is that this is no longer necessary.
Yeah, I love that wish list requirement. That would be amazing. I totally agree. Thank you for that. Vera, you're originally from Russia and living in Italy as an expat there. What's it like practicing compliance and living in Italy?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. I think it's great. I think it's really great. I have never lived so well in my life. Italy is a great place. You eat well, you drink well, you're surrounded by beauty wherever you go.
Yeah.
You have sun almost every day, and you don't spend a fortune to have all that. That's very important. I think it's a great place to live. It's a great place to be. There is a lot to learn in terms of the lifestyle, in terms of the life priorities from the Italians. I think they're very, I wouldn't say basic, because basic doesn't sound positive, but it's positive basic, meaning that they follow the seasons. They tend to be very close to nature. They're slow in their pace, so they are not rushing into. It took me quite a while to get used to that, by the way. Yeah, it's amazing. In terms of the compliance community, I think it's quite a close one because of the language and because of the fact that here compliance is still viewed as the extension of legal. And if you're not a qualified Italian lawyer, people would say, oh, you don't get it. You don't understand anything. You don't know anything. So there is room for improvement in that.
And
but
you're not,
also have a...
You're not a qualified Italian lawyer, right?
No. I'm not a lawyer at all.
Yeah, proving that you can overcome such barriers, but perhaps it is a challenge.
Yeah, but that said, they are still very interested in the behavioral thing. That resonates a lot because I think they actually do the things around psychology, sociology. They tend to like them on some general level. So I think this is a very interesting journey. And it is very exciting to be here and to see how the Italian compliance community is evolving and what's happening. It's great.
Good. That's really wonderful to hear. It is one of my absolute favorite countries, so I'm very envious. Substantively, what are some of the ethics and compliance issues you're seeing practitioners in Europe grappling with the most right now?
There are a couple of important legal developments on the level of requirements. There is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which came into effect on the 1st of January this year. And that means that the large companies will need to report new data sets, ESG data sets, on the 1st of January 2024. And that means that if they are not collecting the data right now, I would say they're a bit in trouble. They should have started already. That's a headache because this directive is all about the non-financial reporting. We had the non-financial reporting directive. That was a very old directive, and the requirements were very basic. Right now, there are new data sets. There are new categories of data to be reported. The main headache is where to get those data and who needs to be in charge of all of that and how you need to ensure the inflow of that data on a continuous basis. That's number one. Number two, supply chains. Another directive on corporate sustainability due diligence probably is finally coming this year because we've been talking about this directive for already 2 years at least. There is an important vote on it. I think it's early May. We'll see how that one goes. But if it's going to be finally adopted, large organizations will be required to identify, prevent, mitigate, and end adverse impacts of their activities on human rights and environment, all the tiers down their supply chains. And this is, of course, quite tricky because I would guess that not all of the organizations know
Correct.
to start with all of the tiers of their supply chains, right? And an incredible challenge. PR, trade sanctions, this is both an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
I think this year sanctions a little bit less because last year it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah, because I think we had 8 or 9 packages of sanctions and trade restrictions.
Yeah.
And they were coming one after another.
Yeah.
And we just couldn't figure out because we were trying to figure out and to fix the situation at some point after every package. But that was absolutely futile because we couldn't guess what's going to go with the next one. And we said in May that, oh, this is okay. But in July, that was no longer okay to do. The trade compliance officer here in Europe, that's for sure, is the person of the year 2023, 22. That's for sure.
A lot of things there to consider. And I think even if companies aren't aware, there are certainly vendors rushing into the space to help with some of those supply chain requirements. Full transparency here, I'm on the advisory board for US Group in the US, and that's certainly an area that they've been focusing on to help organizations that have this quite burdensome and onerous task of really getting transparency and understanding what's going on in the supply chain. I think there's certainly help out there and it's needed. But to your point, do companies even realize they need to make a start on this? And if they need assistance, are they triggering that request internally and getting the help that they need? So a lot of things going on there. And I think you're right, the sanctions is a little gentler now than last year, which is probably a huge relief to our colleagues who focus specifically on that area. And Vera, I've got one more question for you. It's quite an interesting one for me as I've never done this. You took a 2-year career break and spent part of this time focusing on a book you published in 2016. Congratulations on authoring the first book in Russian on corporate compliance. And in light of that, I'd love to understand, especially with the benefit of hindsight and looking back, would you recommend taking a break to others?
That's a great question. Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the book. Of course.
My pleasure.
Well. Yes, the short answer is absolutely yes. I would recommend taking a break to anyone because I think that there was a very important part of my career, a very important time of reflection on what's been done and what I want to do next. And that gave a meaning to everything that followed. Because before that, it was more like everyone else is doing that. I need to be doing that. And what are my peers doing, ex-colleagues, friends, etc., etc.? What are the expectations from parents, relatives, I don't know, again, friends, husband, family, whatever, of me? But when I paused, I finally asked myself, what do I want? What do I really want with my career? Do I want to be in a corporation and climb that corporate career ladder, or do you want to do something else? Do I want to stay in ethics and compliance, or I want to grow grapes and make wine? All of those difficult questions and all of those important reflections. And based on that, on those reflections, we did a lot of big changes for our family because we moved to Italy in that period. I wrote a book. And the book was like a summary of my 11 years experience in it. That was like all of my key learnings and highlights from that journey. And I founded Studio Etica because I understood that at that point of time, maybe corporate life was no longer for me. So I think it was a very productive break, which triggered a lot of big changes. Those changes so far proved to be good changes for better. And that's why, yes, absolutely. It's a great way to give a meaning to everything that you do.
Excellent. Sounds good. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today, but I'm so grateful to you for your time and insights, Vera. Wonderful, much appreciated, and I look forward to seeing your star continue to rise. Thank you for all that you've contributed to the compliance community and, of course, this episode today.
Thank you, Mary, so much for having me and for the great questions. It was a great pleasure. And we will continue our exchange on LinkedIn and elsewhere. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.